Welcome to episode 2, covering the Hammer family. Let me repeat, episode 2. So don't come crying to me if you haven't heard episode 1 and are lost when listening to this one. Also, this is not a podcast for the faint of heart. Listener discretion is advised. Before we go much further, Sarah Bareilles will get us started, and I will see you on the other side.
Everybody's been there, everybody's been stared down by the enemy, falling for the fear and dancing, disappearing, bow down to the mighty. Don't run, stop holding your tongue. Maybe there's a way out of the cage where you live. Maybe one of these days you can let the light in. Show me how big and brave is. Say what you want to say and let the words fall out. Honestly, I want to see you be brave with what you want to say and let the words fall out. Honestly, I want to see you be brave. And since your history of silence won't do you any good, did you think it would? Let your words be anything but empty. Why don't you tell them the truth? Say what you want to say and let the words fall out. Honestly, I want to see you be brave with what you want to say and let the words fall out. Honestly, I want to see you be brave.
The Hammer name became a prominent one in the early 20th century, when Julius Hammer became the leader of the Eastern chapter of the Communist Party of the U.S. But the real power behind the name Hammer was Julius's son, Armand. Armand was a stickler for appearances, and he forged an empire that looked more impressive than it was. Behind the facade, there were men behaving badly. It's surprising the family had any money or power at all. In 2015, 55-year-old Casey Hammer published a memoir called Surviving My Birthright. Now, you may want to get out some paper and colored writing utensils for the making of a flowchart. It's okay. Push pause if you need to. I'm not going anywhere. Okay, you back? All right, here we go. Casey is the granddaughter of Armand Hammer, the subject of most of the previous episode. Her father is Julian Hammer, Armand's one and only son. Her brother is Michael Hammer, the father of Armie Hammer, the actor whose suggestively obscene text and videos were leaked to the wider internet in January of 2021, and one of the stars of Kenneth Branagh's Death on the Nile, which I mention because, among not being one of my favorite adaptations of Agatha Christie's work, Armie's performance was creepy as fuck, and I feel slightly vindicated knowing what I know now. Excuse me while I actually take a breath. Casey wrote the book, in large part, as a form of catharsis. The memoir was self-published, so it's hardly surprising that sales were relatively small, and she was happy for it to be that way because too much attention would bring down the wrath of her family. But Armie's life blew up in January of 2021, and part of the reason for that was an Instagram poster known as the Zen Blonde. Not only did she post about what was happening with Armie, she discovered Casey's book and read out much of it for all and sundry to hear. Casey's life blew up. Surviving My Birthright was published for Casey herself. But by the time the Hammer name had taken over Instagram, not to mention most of social media, Casey is glad to have an opportunity to use it to help other people as well. She is contacted by a documentary crew to be a part in the series that is currently available on Discovery Plus called House of Hammer. The patriarch of the Hammer family, Armand, and that's patriarch with a capital P, only cared about one thing, the longevity of his quote-unquote good name. Members of his family were only important as they related to this goal. It was made clear that you could do whatever you wanted as long as the public continued to believe in the extraordinariness of Armand Hammer. Additionally, Casey learned that women in the Hammer family only existed as appendices to men. No, not appendices. Appendicles. It's my new word and it is awesome. Appendicle. Look it up. It's a thing. Christmas Eve in Casey's early childhood. She is 5 years old and awoken by screaming coming from her parents' bedroom. When she makes it down the hall to peer into their room, she sees her mother in a bra and slip, which are splattered with blood. Her mother comes to her and tells her to go back to bed or Santa won't come. Casey does just that, and when she wakes in the morning, her father, this is Armand's only son Julian, the one he hated, Julian is in the hospital, but he would be back soon. Casey thinks it's her fault that he's missing. From Surviving My Birthright. Quote, night after night, it was the same routine. We would get up in the middle of the night and grab the dog, rushing out of the house to seek refuge in a nearby hotel. My mom would burst into my bedroom and gently get me out of bed while repeating, "Come on, honey, we have to go now. Hurry, sweetheart." I didn't understand what we were running from until I got older. It was my father. My mother always seemed to stay calm until she successfully loaded us in the car, and we were heading down the hill. My father would drink himself into a fit of rage and flip out in the middle of the night. My father would start to attack my mother, and then we would literally run for our lives. My father was in and out of mental institutions for most of my early life. The main problem was that we would never know when he would escape from the hospital or institution and be waiting for us at home. When I was 11 years old, my mother finally left my father. We did it in the middle of the night and took only what we could carry in one trip. My mom found a 2-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica, and at that time I had no idea that we were broke and starving. My grandfather threatened my mother that if she didn't return to my father, he would destroy her. He offered her a lot of money to stay, but she turned him down. My grandfather was ruthless and ended up annihilating my mother in court. My father ended up having to pay her only $200 a month in child support. End quote. It could easily be argued that a man who beats his wife is already off the rails. Knowing this, I still have to say that it is after they leave that Julian really starts to go off the rails. From Surviving My Birthright, quote, my father used to pick me up on the weekends and try to entertain me. I would wait patiently by the window listening for his car, hoping that he hadn't forgotten me. He would take me up to the house, and it was always full of people, mostly young women, that he would introduce as his housekeepers. One time, a young woman, around 22 years old, picked me up from my mother's. When we arrived at the house, there were lots and lots of people there partying and drinking. I walked in, and my father was sitting in his usual chair drinking his usual drink, Jack Daniels. No one was ever allowed to sit in his chair but him. He called it his throne. I waved to my father, trying to get his attention, but he didn't even recognize me. As I walked toward him, 2 girls zipped by and sat on his lap. They were all over him, kissing and fondling him. I felt a wave of nausea come over me as I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them, the vision would disappear. When he finally saw me, he pushed the girls off his lap and stood up. When did you get here? And I guess the real question is, why are you here? End quote.
One time at a party, I'd come out of my bedroom the next morning and everyone was passed out all over the floor. I remember walking by the couch and there were Polaroid pictures of one of my father's housekeepers. And at the time I thought she was eating an ice cream because that's what you did when you were little. I kept looking at the pictures trying to figure out what was happening, and that's how I realized that it wasn't an ice cream, that it was attached to a man. One of the pictures in the background was this figure in the corner in a chair, watching. I recognized that that was my father.
And that was from the second part of the House of Hammer documentary. Continuing on with the previous citation. I was confused and didn't understand what she was doing and why she was touching him. Then I felt awful, like I was going to throw up. The memory of my brother flashed in my brain. I remembered I did this to my brother. He had made me touch him, but I never looked at it and had no idea that this is what it looked like. All of a sudden, I panicked. What if there were pictures of me doing that to my brother? It must be okay if my father was watching. He made it seem like a game, and I remember telling him I didn't want to play. He said if I didn't, he would hurt me and tell Mom that I was bad. I was afraid of him. When he used to hurt me, he would hold me down so that I couldn't move. I was terrified of his power and realized that I'd had better play the game. Then I heard something that snapped me back to the living room at my father's. Someone was coming down the hall, and I was scared. What if I got caught looking at the pictures? What if my dad got mad at me? I quickly shoved them back in the purse and ran to my room. I pretended that I was still asleep. Deep down, I have always known that my father did things to me, but he was my father, and I didn't want to believe it. Even when my sister told me what he did to her, I doubted it. I just dismissed the information and detached myself from the possibility. He was clearly very sick, but he couldn't have done what he did to my sister to me. All I ever wanted from him was his love, and because of that, I would defend him until the day he died. I didn't want to keep exploring the past due to the fear that I'd have to acknowledge that he did something wrong to me. I want to believe that he loved me and it was my knight in shining armor. I still detach myself from those thoughts. I want to believe the fantasy that he loved me. He was my only link to my grandfather. He could talk to my grandfather and get him to notice me. All I wanted was to get Grandpa's attention. I wanted him to see that I wasn't like everyone else. I was different. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted Grandpa to love me. I wanted him to see that I wasn't a loser and that I was special. I didn't want to be alone. I was a hammer, and I refused to give up any connection to the family. Anyway, I didn't think anyone would believe me. No one ever did. No one ever came running when I cried. No one ever protected me from the awful things, and no one ever heard me speak. I couldn't cause trouble. I had to be a good girl. I wanted my father to notice me. I wanted to help him. Everyone always said bad things about him, so it was up to me to protect him. I was Daddy's little girl, and he was supposed to love me. He was supposed to rescue me and help me be safe. In my made-up reality, he always did." End quote. In that reading, I not only hear the twisted logic of a child who wants to be loved by her family, but I also hear screaming echoes of what must have been Julian's voice paralleling Casey's. Julian did this to his daughter, what his own father essentially did to him, deny her a healthy relationship with her dad. Armand Hammer claimed to doubt Julian's paternity. He was not only ready to leave his wife and son in Russia, he made a point of never letting Julian forget that he was probably not really a Hammer. Eventually, a paternity test proved that Julian was a Hammer, but Armand continued to hate him. Apologists say that Julian is a reminder of Armand's failure in Russia. Some of them say it is because of Julian's bad behavior. Armand never wanted the outside world to see anything negative about the Hammers. Although both of these things are true, I feel like there's not enough of an explanation. Armand was a cruel person by nature. There seems to be something in the adage, you only hurt the ones you love, although I am not sure Armand was capable of actually loving anyone. He despised his own son. We are told he hated Michael, Julian's son, his grandson, but that he may have loved Army, Michael's son, Armand's great-grandson, and his namesake. If we had a complete DNA profile of all of these people and a true and full biographical history of their lives, we could have a serious discussion about nature versus nurture. But we do not have that, in large part because of the omerta drilled into all the Hammers by the patriarch, Armand. Only Hammers were allowed to know what went on in the Hammer family. Casey would lead us to believe that much of Julian's insanity was due to the massive quantities of drugs the man poured into his system. I do not doubt that the drugs played a part, but I also wonder how much was a heritable propensity for cruelty, and how much was learned from living in a sadistic environment, never able to feel love from those who are supposed to give it. Regardless, Julian was a hideous human being. He was known as the Hugh Hefner of the Pacific Palisades. His house was a perpetual orgy. There was a bowl of cocaine on the entry table and teenage girls, and only teenage girls, everywhere. When Julian's wife leaves, she only takes the girls, Casey and her older sister. But Michael is left with Julian.
My mom said that the biggest regret of her life was letting Michael decide to stay with my father. It was a while before my mother let me go down and visit my father. Michael, my brother, would bring his friends up to party, and they would hit on them as well. The drugs were free-flowing, so it was a very free atmosphere. The second trip I took from Washington down to visit my father, everyone was drinking way too much. and my father offered my brother $1 million for his girlfriend.
Come on. You having this talk?
My brother, it was like a monster unleashed. They both said, I'm going to kill you, and they ran outside. And when I finally circled the building, I saw police had separated them. The cops didn't arrest either one of them and let them both drive away, intoxicated as they were. And Michael's girlfriend ended up going with my father, quote unquote, to tame the situation. She was older than most of the girls, probably 19. She ended up living with my father for like another 8 months.
I find it interesting that women in this doc are generally not named, except Olga. I mean, they do have names, but when they're described, it's generally my mother, my sister, Michael's fiance, and although the men are also referred to as my father or my brother, this is also interchanged with their actual names. So for instance, Casey will talk about her brother, but also call him Michael. But the use of my sister is always my sister, and she doesn't call Michael's fiance, eventually wife, by her name, Drew. I hate to call a cigar anything other than a cigar, but this seems suggestive, does it not? Women are interchangeable and don't deserve names, in contrast to the men who have multiple roles and their realness is signified by the use of their name. Eventually, Casey's mother remarries and moves to Washington State. They leave secretly and refuse to let Casey talk to her father before they go. Once they are in Washington, it is only Casey's persistent nagging that wears them down enough so that she is finally allowed to call her father. It's only later that Casey learns that her grandfather had threatened to destroy them and take Casey forever if they tried to leave the state of California. Casey calls her father, excited to finally talk to him. Julian's response leaves much to be desired. He tells her he's busy, can't talk, but she should come and visit sometime. Casey again nags, and eventually her mother and stepfather allow her to go back to visit. But this only results in incidents like the following from the House of Hammer.
I remembered one in particular incident where there was a lot of noise and party going on. My brother was there as well. My father started shooting at the walls. And then my father was like, wait, I've got an idea, and said to me, Casey, hold this phone book. And I did it, thinking, they're not gonna shoot at me. So the phone book was held up to the right of my head. I dropped the phone book. I remember taking cover.
By the time Casey is in high school, her mother has moved to the Philippines, and Casey has a reprieve of sorts from the Hammermen. She eventually wants to go to university, but with no money to pay for it on her own, she's at the mercy of her grandfather Armand, who insists she go to Pepperdine, where her brother Michael is already studying. She's back to having his looming presence in her life.
Michael was 27, 28 when he first met Army's mother, Drew. He was flying first class and he was really drunk, and I guess Drew was sitting next to him, and she said before she got off the airplane, she was planning to marry him. She was very religious and very not like what Michael goes out with. So when he got off the airplane and he was saying, I met someone, we were all like, sure, okay. And then when we met Drew, we just thought, oh, that's never gonna last. But my grandfather rolled out the red carpet for her and her parents. He wanted Michael and Drew to get married because this was a wholesome, Tulsa, wealthy family that was very religious. And my grandfather believed that Drew could change Michael.
After we got out of college, Michael came over one night to Casey's house and introduced this woman as his fiance, and we got to know her. But then he was with other girls who went out with us, and, you know, we would ask questions like, oh, did you break up with your fiance? No, she's fine. She just couldn't come out tonight.
Casey decides she wants to be in retail management, and she's offered a job in Hawaii. Her grandfather thinks this is ridiculous. This is the one time she checks her courage and finds it's actually there. She comes up with what is essentially a prospectus to convince him. The letter she writes doesn't really do the trick, but meeting him in person actually seems to. I think it is the fact that she had the guts to not roll over. I think for half a second he was impressed. But then, in October 1990, her grandfather is dying. She gets a call from one of his physicians telling her that her grandfather is not doing well and she may want to come and see him. No one else seems to question this. I certainly didn't the first 3 or 4 times I read this. HIPAA wasn't enacted until 1996, but there was still an industry standard of patient privacy. But let's leave that out of the mix for now. What long-term personal physician of Armand Hammer would just pick up the phone and call anyone about Armand's condition? Anybody out there think he might be risking his career and maybe his life or sanity by telling someone, anyone, about Armand without Armand's express directive? Armand either gave this doc the okay, even asked him to call Casey, or this guy had some supersized cojones on him. Both options suggest a very interesting story, and I want to know that story. But they don't tell us, and Casey catches a flight to see her grandfather before he dies. Jesus Christ. Armand Hammer had this woman, Rosa Maria, who acts as his nurse, cum PA. Really, she gets off on being his bulldog. No one is actually sure what she does or is to him, but they met during the end of Francis's life. That's his third wife people keep up. And the next thing everyone knows, she's living in his house. Anyway, Casey knocks. Rosa Maria answers and says, it's not a good time. Look, biatch, Casey lives in Hawaii, and that's her grandfather. Let her in the goddamn house. Casey cries all the way back to the hotel. I'm gonna flip a fucking table. From Surviving My Birthright. Quote, I tried to make the best of the rest of the day. I called my father, and Gene said he was busy and would talk to me another time. I called my brother, and his secretary said that he was in a meeting. This was all too familiar, and I started to become angry. I opened up the minibar and started eating and drinking. I was alone to wallow in my self-pity. The next day, I was determined to see Grandpa, and I was not going to give up. One way or another, I would go to his house. Again, I called, and was so excited that I was able to talk to him. This time, he made a commitment to a time I could see him, but it wasn't until the next day. He sounded awful, and it really scared me. End quote. This whole scenario is just bizarre. She spends all day, literally, buying him a gift. Got the perfect one, and walks up to his front door and just knocks. Like people don't just show up at other people's homes every goddamn day and knock. Bold as brass. From Surviving My Birthright. Dr. Armand Hammer was my grandfather, and I was scared of him. Actually, everyone was scared of him. And being a good little soldier, I followed suit. I remember the Sunday afternoons driving to his house for family brunch. We would arrive early and sit out front and wait, leaving just enough time to get out of the car, walk up the stairs, and ring the doorbell. We were never allowed to be early or late, but always punctual. I often wondered if my parents thought we were invisible sitting out front of his house. All he had to do was look outside. I never understood why we couldn't just go in. Everything was scheduled, rarely changing. Even as we got older, it was the same routine. We would each sit out front of Grandpa's house waiting to step out of our individual cars and greet each other before climbing the stairs. We each pretended to look busy and ignored each other until it was time. Then we would act like we had just driven up. It didn't make sense to me. End quote. Casey gets a call the next morning from Armand's secretary. So much better than Rosa Maria. The secretary says Armand can see her at 4. The whole scene is pitiful, in the classic sense of the word. This is a bless your heart moment. Armand tells her the financial arrangements after his death. Also surreal because Casey was a girl, and because not understood until after his death 2 months later, none of it was true. What Armand tells her is a very well thought out and equitable dealing of his finances among his heirs. But when the will is read, everyone is left relatively out in the cold. And even though Armand verbally talked to Casey like she was going to have some control over the outcome of the dispersal, it was her brother Michael who became the executor of the estate. From Surviving My Birthright, quote, "After the announcement of Grandpa's death, my brother and his wife were caught stealing from his home. They were putting art, valuables, jewelry, money, and practically anything else they could grab inside rolled-up rugs and carrying them down the stairs to be loaded into the vans waiting out front. They were trying to go as quickly as possible, but Francis's niece saw them and called the police. She was suing the estate because the house was in Francis's name and would take possession of the house and some of the belongings once Grandpa died. She must have had a feeling that something might happen because she raced to the house as soon as the death announcement was made. By the time the police arrived, my brother had talked his way out of getting arrested by saying that he was just taking Grandpa's things and not Francis's. The police made them empty the vans and put everything back in the house, but one loaded van drove away unnoticed. Sitting at the airport, I was in shock. My brother and his wife were stealing from my grandfather as he lay dead on his bed. How could anybody be so callous and disrespectful? I should have expected it from him and seen that it was all just a sign of things to come." End quote. You can tell that Michael didn't think he'd get control of the estate. Thus, the frantic clearing out of Armand's house. One of those trucks did manage to get away before the cops came, and no one knows what was in that truck. Well, no one except Michael. Having just seen and spoken with her grandfather not 2 months prior, Casey was gobsmacked by the reading of the will. Was this another one of Armand's games? Or did he think he had taken care of the will but really had not? My father died of the same cancer, multiple myeloma, and I can testify that the illness often causes memory and cognitive issues, as the bone marrow stops being able to send oxygen to the brain. So either scenario could be accurate for Armand Hammer, and the colossally stupid way the will was laid out. Next time, IAR will cover Casey's journey to sanity and the culmination of Armand Hammer's influence, Army Hammer, and his proclivities. If you like the show, please take a moment and give it a review on whatever platform you are listening. There is a Patreon if you want to support the pod in a financial way, and just go to patreon.com and search for It's All Relative. If that's too much for you, at least like and subscribe. Thoughts or comments, contact details are in the show notes. If you hate what you've heard, why didn't you stop listening 25 minutes ago? Why the fuck are you listening to the end of this episode right now? That's on you, dude. Vicha will sing you out, and I will talk at you next time on It's All Relative.
You think that I'm stupid, I got stars in my eyes. If you cross the line, then I ain't playing it nice. I walk the walk, I talk the talk, don't need to hear about what you want. I'm quiet, but I came to rock. You think that you know me, but no, you don't know me like that. I don't care about what you heard. No, you don't know me like that. Talking shit like I'm a nerd. No, you don't know me like that. No, you don't know me like that. No, you don't know me like that. Sit down and watch. Well, I am making a scene. Look what I got. Something that you couldn't dream about to get out.